Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and humility, a revolution of the heart. Picture yourself in the dusty streets of Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago. Crowd is stirring, rumors are spreading, a Galilean preacher named Jesus is shaking up traditional teachings. But it's not through fiery political speeches or complex theological debates that he's captivating hearts. No, it's through simple yet profound teachings on how we should live with one another. Today, dear listeners, we're going to dive into two of the most revolutionary and challenging themes of Jesus' teaching: forgiveness and humility. These concepts, though seemingly simple, have the power to radically transform our lives and communities. Get ready to be challenged, inspired, and perhaps even a little unsettled by Jesus' radical wisdom. To understand the power of Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and humility, we need to place ourselves in the context of his time. First-century Judea was a society marked by deep divisions between Jews and Romans, between rich and poor, between the righteous and sinners. In this world, revenge was often considered a virtue, a means of restoring honor. Humility, on the other hand, was seen as a weakness. The powerful asserted themselves through strength, the learned through knowledge, the religious through ostentatious piety. It's in this context that Jesus comes to propose a radically different vision of human relationships and our relationship with God. His teachings on forgiveness and humility are not simple moral advice, but a call to a revolution of the heart. One of Jesus' most striking teachings on forgiveness is found in the parable of the unforgiving servant. Listen carefully, for this story has the power to revolutionize our understanding of forgiveness. It all begins with a question from Peter. "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me?" "Up to 7 times. Peter thinks he's being generous. In rabbinical tradition, it was taught that one should forgive 3 times. Peter doubles this number and adds one more. But Jesus' answer exceeds all expectation. "I tell you, not 7 times, 77 times. In other words, forgiveness must be unlimited. Then Jesus tells this parable. When his companions saw what had happened, they were deeply saddened and went to tell their master all that had happened. Then the master sent for the servant and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you your debt in full, because you begged me to do so. Shouldn't you also have had pity on your companion, just as I had pity on you?' And his master, enraged, delivered him to the executioners until he had paid all that he owed." This parable is strikingly powerful. The first servant owed an astronomical sum, 10,000 talents. To give you an idea, 1 talent was equivalent to about 20 years of a worker's wages. 10,000 talents thus represented 200,000 years of work, an impossible debt to repay. The king, in an act of extraordinary grace, cancels this colossal debt. But what does the servant do? He immediately goes to find a fellow servant who owes him a relatively modest sum, 100 denarii, about 3 months' wages, and demands immediate repayment, going so far as to have him thrown in prison. The contrast is striking. The servant's ingratitude and harshness are shocking. And that's precisely the effect Jesus wants to produce. He wants us to understand the magnitude of the forgiveness God offers us and the absurdity of our refusal to forgive others. Let's now turn to another crucial teaching of Jesus: humility. In a world obsessed with status and power, Jesus proposes a radically different vision of true greatness. One day, the disciples come to Jesus with a question that concerns them. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? We can imagine the tension in the air. Perhaps each one secretly hopes that Jesus will designate him as the greatest. But Jesus' answer surprises them all. He calls a little child, places him in the midst of them, and says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Imagine the scene. The disciples, grown men, some perhaps already elderly, are invited to become like little children. In the society of the time, children had no status, no power. They were entirely dependent on adults for their survival and well-being. By using this image, Jesus completely reverses the world's values. True greatness, he tells us, does not lie in power, status, or achievements, but in humility, dependence on God, the simple trust of a child. Later, Jesus will reinforce this teaching through his own actions. During the last meal with his disciples, he will rise from the table, take a towel and water, and begin to wash his disciples' feet, task normally reserved for the humblest servants. These two teachings, on forgiveness and humility, are intimately linked. Humility is the soil in which forgiveness can flourish. Why? Because humility allows us to recognize our own need for forgiveness. Let's go back to the parable of the unforgiving servant. This servant's problem was not only his lack of mercy, but also his lack of humility. He did not realize the magnitude of the grace he had received. He did not see that, compared to his own debt to the king, his companion's debt was insignificant. Similarly, humility helps us forgive by reminding us that we too need forgiveness. It prevents us from placing ourselves on a moral pedestal, judging others while ignoring our own faults. Dear listeners, you may be wondering, what do these teachings mean for us today, 2,000 years later? How can unlimited forgiveness and radical humility transform our lives and our world in the 21st century? A response to polarization. In an increasingly divided world, where differences of opinion often lead to hostility and broken relationships, forgiveness and humility offer a path to reconciliation and mutual understanding. An antidote to ego culture. In a society that often values self-promotion and celebrity, Jesus' call to humility reminds us that true value does not lie in public recognition, but in character and service. A path to personal healing. Refusal to forgive can be a poison that eats away at our soul. By embracing forgiveness, we free ourselves from the burden of resentment and bitterness. A model for conflict resolution. Imagine how our families, workplaces, communities could be transformed if we approached conflicts with humility and a willingness to forgive. Path to authentic spirituality. Humility allows us to recognize our dependence on God and our constant need for His grace. It protects us against spiritual pride and hypocrisy. We must recognize that these teachings of Jesus are profoundly countercultural and often difficult to put into practice. Unlimited forgiveness may seem unfair or even dangerous in some situations. Humility can be perceived as weakness in a world that values self-assertion. But Jesus is not calling us to passive weakness or blind acceptance of injustice. Forgiveness, he teaches, does not erase responsibility or the need for justice. The humility he advocates is not a lack of self-esteem, but a right understanding of our place before God and others. The challenge for us is to find ways to live these values in our specific context. How can we forgive while establishing healthy boundaries? How can we be humble while defending truth and justice? Let's take a moment to reflect personally on these teachings. I invite you to meditate on these questions. Is there someone in your life whom you find difficult to forgive? What makes this forgiveness difficult? How could you cultivate more humility in your daily life? What habits or attitudes could help you become like a little child? Think about a recent conflict in your life. How could the principles of forgiveness and humility have changed your approach to this conflict? In what areas of your life do you find it most difficult to practice humility? Why? How does your understanding of God's forgiveness influence your ability to forgive others? Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and humility are not mere moral rules. They have the power to radically transform our lives and relationships. Forgiveness has the power to break the cycles of revenge and resentment that poison so many lives and communities. It opens the door to healing and reconciliation. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, forgiveness is not an occasional act, it is a permanent attitude. Humility, for its part, frees us from the burden of always having to prove our worth or superiority. It allows us to learn from others, to recognize our mistakes, and to grow. As C.S. Lewis wrote, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Together, forgiveness and humility create space for more authentic and deeper relationships. They allow us to see others and ourselves through the eyes of grace rather than judgment. Dear friends, as we conclude our exploration of Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and humility, let's remember that these words are not simply distant ideals. They are an invitation to a new way of living, a way that has the power to transform not only our individual lives, but also our communities and our world. The unlimited forgiveness and radical humility that Jesus teaches are like seeds that, once planted in our hearts, can produce extraordinary fruit. They have the potential to heal old wounds, reconcile broken relationships, and create communities marked by grace and compassion. Imagine for a moment what our world would be like if we took these teachings seriously. Families reconciled after years of conflict, workplaces where collaboration replaces fierce competition, communities where differences are welcomed with curiosity rather than suspicion, nations that seek mutual understanding rather than domination. Of course, living according to these principles is not easy. It requires courage, perseverance, and a constant willingness to question oneself. It sometimes means going against the dominant values of our society. But this is precisely what Jesus calls us to be salt and light in a world that desperately needs healing and hope. How can we concretely put these teachings into practice in our daily lives? Here are some suggestions. Practice daily forgiveness. Start with small offenses. Each evening, review your day and consciously forgive those who have irritated or hurt you. Cultivate gratitude. Humility and gratitude go hand in hand. Keep a gratitude journal, noting each day the blessings you have received. Listen actively. Humility allows us to truly listen to others. Practice active listening, seeking to understand rather than respond. Ask for forgiveness. Recognizing our own faults and asking for forgiveness is a powerful act of humility. Make a habit of sincerely apologizing when you are wrong. Serve others. Follow Jesus' example by seeking opportunities to serve others, especially those who can offer nothing in return. Meditate on God's forgiveness. Spend time reflecting on the magnitude of the forgiveness God offers you. This can help you forgive others. Practice self-reflection. Regularly take time to examine your motivations and action. Humility allows us to honestly see our strengths and weaknesses. It's important to recognize that the path of forgiveness and humility is not always easy. You will likely encounter challenges. Forgiveness may seem impossible in the face of deep wounds. Humility may be confused with weakness in some contexts. You might face misunderstanding or even rejection from those who don't share these values. But the rewards of this path are immense. An inner freedom that comes from no longer being chained by resentment. Deeper and more authentic relationships. An inner peace that comes from not having to constantly compare ourselves to others or prove our worth. Continuous personal and spiritual growth. As we end this reflection on Jesus' teachings concerning forgiveness and humility, I invite you to consider how you might integrate these principles into your daily life. Perhaps there's someone you need to forgive. Perhaps there's an area of your life where you need to cultivate more humility. Whatever your situation, remember that every little step counts. Each act of forgiveness, each gesture of humility is like a stone thrown into a pond. Its ripples can extend far beyond what we can imagine. Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and humility are not simply ideals to be admired from afar. They are a call to action, an invitation to a transformed life. A life that, little by little, can transform our world. May these words of Jesus continue to resonate in your hearts and shape your lives. May you find the strength to forgive even when it's difficult, and the grace to walk in humility, knowing that this is where true greatness lies, according to the kingdom of God.